Chapter 22 of The Dust Flower by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. It was Steptoe who discovered that the little back spare room was empty, though William had informed him that he thought it strange that Madam didn't appear for breakfast. Steptoe knew then that what he had expected had come to pass, and, if earlier than he had looked for it, perhaps it was just as well. Having tapped at Madam's door and received no answer, he ventured within. Everything there confirming his belief, he went to inform Mr. Rash. As Mr. Rash was shaving in the bathroom, Steptoe plodded round the bedroom, picking up scattered articles of clothing, putting outside the door the shoes which had been taken off on the previous night, digging another pair of shoes from the shoe cupboard, and otherwise busying himself as usual. Even when Mr. Rash had re-entered the bedroom, the valet made no immediate reference to what had happened in the house. He approached the subject indirectly by saying, as he laid out an old velvet house jacket on the bed, "I suppose if Mr. Rash ain't going out for his breakfast, you put this on for home." Mr. Rash, who was buttoning his collar before the mirror, said over his shoulder, "But I am going out for my breakfast. Why shouldn't I? I always do." Steptoe carried the house jacket back to the closet. "I thought as Rash only did that so as Madam could have the dining room to herself, private-like." As a way of expressing the fact that Allerton had never eaten a meal with Letty, the choice of words was neat. "Well, what then?" "Oh, nothing, sir. I was only thinking that as Madam was no longer here." Allerton wheeled round, his fingers clawing at the collar stud, his face growing bloodless. "Madam seems to have left us. I suppose that after I'd gone upstairs last night, Mr. Rash and her must have had some sort of understanding, and she went." "Went?" Allerton's tone was almost a scream. Leaping on the old man, he took him by the shoulders, shaking him. "Damn you! Get it out! What are you trying to tell me?" Steptoe quaked and cowered. "Why, nothing, sir. Only when William said as Madam hadn't come down to her breakfast, I went to her door and tapped, and there wasn't no one in the room. Mr. Rash had better go and see for himself." The young man not only released the older one, but pushed him aside with a force which sent him staggering backwards. Over the stairs he scrambled, he plunged. Though he had never entered the back spare room since allotting it to Letty as her own, he threw the door open now as if the place was on fire. But by the time Steptoe had followed and reached the threshold, Allerton had calmed suddenly. He stood in front of the open closet, vaguely examining its contents. He picked up the little gold band, chucked it a few inches into the air, caught it and put it down. He looked into the little leather purse, poured out its notes and pennies into his hand, replaced them, and put that also down again. He opened the old red volume lying on the table by the bed, finding The Little Mermaid marked by 2 stiff dried sprays of dust flower, which more than ever merited its name. When he turned round to where Steptoe, white and scared by this time, was standing in the open doorway, his, Allerton's, face was drawn in mingled convulsion and bewilderment. With 2 strides he was across the room. "Tell me what you know about this, you confounded old schemer, before I kick you out." Shivering and shaking, Steptoe nevertheless held himself with dignity. I'll tell you what I know, Mr. Rash. It ain't very much. I know that Madam has had it in her mind for some time past that, unless she took steps, Mr. Rash would never be free to marry the young lady what he was in love with." "What does she mean by taking steps?" "I don't know exactly, but I think it was the kind of steps that would give Mr. Rash his release quicker nor any other." Allerton's arm was raised as if to strike a blow. "And you let her?" The old face was set steadily. "I didn't do nothing but what Mr. Rash himself told me to do." "Told you to do?" "Yes, Mr. Rash. 6 months ago, the morning after you brought Madam into the house. I was to get you out of the marriage, you said. But I think Madam has done it all of her own accord." "But why? Why should she?" Steptoe smiled dimly. "Oh, don't Mr. Rash see? Madam had give herself to him heart and spirit and soul. If she couldn't go to the good for him, she'd go to the bad. So long as she served him, it didn't matter to Madam what she done. And if I was Mr. Rash—" Allerton's spring was like that of a tiger. Before Steptoe felt that he had been seized, he was on his back on the floor with Allerton kneeling on his chest. "You old reptile, I'm going to kill you!" You may kill me, Mr. Rash, but it won't make no difference to Madam having loved you." Two strong hands at his throat choked back more words, till the sound of his strangling startled Allerton into a measure of self-control. He scrambled to his feet again. "Get up!" Steptoe dragged himself up, and after dusting himself with his fingers, stood once more passive and respectful, as if nothing violent had occurred. "If I was Mr. Rash," he went on imperturbably, "I'd let well enough alone." It was Allerton who was breathless. What do you mean by well enough alone?" "Well, the way I see it, it's this way. Mr. Rash is married to one young lady and wants to marry another." He broke off to ask significantly, "I suppose that'd be so, Mr. Rash?" "Well, what then?" "Why, then he can't marry the other young lady till the young lady what he's married to sets him free. Now, that young lady what he's married to has started out to set him free, and if I was Mr. Rash, I'd let her." "You'd let her throw herself away for me?" "I'd let her do anything what showed I know my own mind, Mr. Rash. If it wouldn't be stepping out of my place to say so, I wish Mr. Rash could tell which of these two young ladies he wanted, and which he'd be willing for to—" "How can I tell that when both have a claim on me?" "Yes, but only one has a claim on Mr. Rash now. Madam has given up her claim so as to make things easier for him. There's only one claim now for Mr. Rash to think about, and that makes everything simple." An embarrassed cough drew Steptoe's attention to the fact that someone was standing in the hall outside. It was William, with a note on a silver tray. Beside the note stood a small square package tied with a white ribbon, which looked as if it contained a piece of wedding cake. His whisper of explanation was the word "wild goose," but a cocking of his eye gave Steptoe to understand that William was quite aware of wading in the current of his employer's love affairs. Moreover, the fact that Steptoe and his master should be making so free with the little back spare room was, in William's judgment, evidence of drama. "What's this?" Glancing at the handwritten note on the envelope, and taking in the fact that a small square package looking like a bit of wedding cake stood beside it, Allerton jumped back. Steptoe might have been presenting him with a snake. I don't know, Mr. Rash. William has brought it up. Someone seems to have left it at the door." As Steptoe continued to stand with his offering held out, Allerton had no choice but to take up the letter and break the seal. He read it with little grunts, intending to signify ironic laughter, but which betrayed no more than bitterness of soul. "Dear Rash, I've come to see that we shall never get out of the impasse in which we seem to have been caught, unless someone takes a stand. I have therefore decided to take one. Of the three of us it is apparently easiest for me, so that I am definitely breaking our engagement and sending you back your ring. Any claim I may have had on you I give up of my own accord, so that as far as I am concerned, you are free. This will simplify your situation and enable you to act according to the dictates of your heart. Believe me, dear Rash, affectionately yours, Barbara Walbrook." Though it was not his practice to take his valet into the secret of his correspondence, the circumstances were exceptional. Allerton handed the letter to Steptoe without a word. As the old man was feeling for his glasses and adjusting them to his nose, Mr. Rash turned absently away, picking up the volume of Hans Andersen, from which the sprays of dust flower tumbled out. On putting them back, his eyes fell upon the words which someone had marked with a pencil. Day by day she grew dearer to the prince, but he loved her as one loves a child. The thought of making her his queen never crossed his mind. A spasm passed over his face. He turned the page impatiently. Here he caught the words which had been underlined. "I am with him every day. I will watch over him, love him, and sacrifice my life for him." Shutting the book with a bang and throwing it on the table, he wheeled round to where Steptoe, having folded the letter, was taking off his spectacles. "Well, what do you say to that?" "What I'd say to that, Mr. Rash, it's as good as a legal document. If any young lady who wrote that letter was to bring an action for breach, this here pipe would nail her." "So where am I now?" Free as a lark, Mr. Rash. One lady has turned you down, and the other has gone to the bad for you. So if you was to begin again with a third, you'd have a clean sheet." He groaned aloud. "Oh, go to the—" Without stating the place to which Steptoe was to go, he marched out of the room and back to his dressing upstairs. More dispassionate was the early morning scene in the little basement eating-house, in which the stunted Hebrew maid of Polish culture was serving breakfast to two gentlemen who had plainly met by appointment. Beside the one was an oblong packet, of which some of the contents, half displayed, had the opulent engraved decorations of stock certificates. The other gentleman, resembling an operatic brigand a little the worse for wear, was saying with conviction, "Oil? Don't talk to me. No, sir, there's enough oil in Milligan Centre alone to run every car in Europe and America at this present time. Well, if you include North Milligan, where it's beginning to shoot like the old faithful geezer." "Awfully obliged to you, Judson," the other took up humbly. "I thought that bunch of nuts hadn't ever—" "Oh, so did I, Gorry. I've sweated blood over this job all winter. Queer the way men are made. Now, you'd hardly believe the work I've had to show that lot of boneheads, that because a guy's a detective in one line, he ain't a detective in every line. Homicide, I said, was Gorry Larrabin's speciality, and where there's no homicide, he's no more a detective than a busted rubber tyre." "You said it," Gorry corroborated earnestly. "One of the cussed things about detecting is that fellows get afraid of you. Think because you're keeping up your end you might be down on every little thing, and that you ain't a sport." "That must be hard," Judson said sympathetically. "I'll tell you it's hard. Lots of fun I'd like to be in on, but you're kept outside." The drawbacks of the detective profession not being what Judson chiefly had on his mind, he allowed the subject to drop. An interval of silence for the consumption of a plateful of golden toasties permitted Gorry to begin again reminiscently. "By the way, Judson, do you remember that about 6 months ago you was chewing over that girl of yours and what had become of her?" To himself Judson said, "That's the talk now we're coming to business." Aloud he said, "Why, yes, seems to me I do. She's been gone so long I'd almost forgotten her." "Well, what do you know? Last night, let me see, was it last night? No, night before last, I kind of got wind of her." "Heaven's sake!" "Guy I know was coming through East 67th Street, and there was my lady, dressed to beat the band, leading one of them little toy dogs, and talking to a swell toff that lives in one of them houses. Got the number here in my pocket-book." While he was searching his pocket-book, Judson asked breathlessly, "Couldn't be no mistake?" "Ah, it's nix on mistakes. That guy don't make 'em. Surest thing on the force. He said, 'Good afternoon, Miss Gravely,' and she said, 'Good afternoon' back to him, just like that. The guy walked on and turned a corner, but when he peeped back, there was the couple going to the house just like husband and wife. What do you know?" "What do I know? I know I'll spill his claret for him before the week is out." "Ah, here it is. Knew I had that address on me somewheres." He handed the scrap of paper across the table. "That's his name and number. Seems to me you may have a good thing there, Judson, if you know how to work it." In another early morning scene, the ermine was cleaning her nest, and you know how fastidious she is supposed to be as to personal spotlessness. The ermine in question did not belie her reputation, as you would have seen by a glance at the 3 or 4 rooms which made up what she called her flat. Nothing was ever whiter than the woodwork of the flat and its furnishings. Nothing was ever whiter than the little lady's dress. The hair was white, and even the complexion, the one like silver, the other like the camellia. Having breakfasted from white dishes placed on a white napkin, she was busy with a carpet sweeper, sweeping up possible crumbs. In an interval of the carpet sweeper's buzz, she heard the telephone. "Hello?" The male voice was commanding. "Yes?" The response was sweetly precise. "Is this Red Point 3284W?" "It is." "Can I speak to Miss Henrietta Towle?" "This is Miss Henrietta Towle." "This is the Brooklyn Bridge Emergency Hospital. Do you know a girl named Letitia Rashleigh?" There was a second's hesitation. "I was once a lady's maid to a lady whose maiden name was Rashleigh. I think there may be a connection somewhere." "She was found unconscious on a car in the subway last night and brought in here." "And had she mentioned me?" She hasn't mentioned anyone since she came to, but we find your address on a paper in her pocket." "That seems singular, but I expect there's a purpose behind it. Is that everything she had?" "No, she had 45 cents and a thimble." "A thimble? Just an ordinary thimble?" "Yes, an ordinary thimble, except that it has initials on the edge. H.T. from H.S. Does that mean anything to you?" "Yes, that means something to me. May I ask how to reach the hospital?" This being explained, Miss Towle promised to appear without delay, begging that in the meantime everything be done for Miss Rashleigh's comfort. She was not perturbed. She was not surprised. She did not wonder who Letitia Rashleigh could be, or why her address should be found in the girl's pocket. She was as quiet and serene as if such incidents belonged to every day's work. Dressed for the street, she was all in black. A mantua covered with bugles and braid dropped from her shoulders, while a bonnet which rose to a pointed arch above her brow and allowed the silver knob of her hair to escape behind, gave her a late 19th century dignity. Before leaving the house she took 2 volumes from her shelves, read first in one, then in the other, sat pensive for a while, with head bent and eyes shaded, after which she replaced her books, turned the key in her door, and set forth for Brooklyn Bridge. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Dust Flower by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. "Why you should hold me responsible," Barbara was saying, "I can't begin to imagine. Surely I've done everything I could to simplify matters, to straighten them out, and to give you a chance to rectify your folly. I've effaced myself, I've broken my heart, I've promised Aunt Marion to go in for a job for which I'm not fitted and don't care a rap. And yet you come here accusing me. But, Barb, I'm not accusing you. If I'm accusing anyone, it's myself. Only I can't speak without you taking me up. There you go. Oh, Rash, dear, if you've only been able to control yourself, nothing of this would have happened, not from the first." She was pacing up and down the little reception-room and rubbing her hands together, while the twisting of the fish-tail of her hydrangea-coloured robe, like an eel in agony, emphasized her agitation. Rashleigh was seated, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed between his hands, of which the fingers clutched and tore at the masses of his hair. Only when he spoke did he lift his woebegone black eyes. "Well, I didn't control myself," he admitted impatiently. "That's settled. Why go back to it? The question is, yes, why go back to it? That's you all over, Rash. You can do what no one else in his senses would ever think of doing, and when you've upset the whole apple cart it must never be referred to again. I'm to accept and keep silence. Well, I've kept silence. I've gone all winter like a muzzled dog. I've wheedled that girl and kowtowed to her and made her think I was fond of her, which I am in a way. You may not believe it, but I am. And what's the result? She gets sick of the whole business, runs away, and you come here and throw the whole blame on me." He tried to speak with special calmness. "Bob, listen to me. What I said was this." She came to a full stop in front of him, her arms outspread. "Oh, Rash, dear, I know perfectly well what you said. You don't have to go all over it again. I'm not deaf. If you'd only not be so excitable." He jumped to his feet. "I'm excitable, I know, Bob. I confess it. Everybody knows it. What I'm trying to tell you is that I'm not excited now." She laughed, a little mocking laugh, and started once more to pace up and down. "Oh, very well, you're not excited now. Then that's understood. You never are excited. You're as calm as a mountain." She paused again, though at a distance. "Now, what is it you're going to do? That's what you've come to ask me, isn't it? Are you going to run after her? Are you going to let her go? Are you going to divorce her if she gives you the opportunity? If you divorce her, are you going to—" "But, Barb, I can't decide all these questions now. What I want to do is to find her." "Well, I haven't got her here. Why don't you go after her? Why don't you apply to the police? Why don't you—" "Yes, but that's just what I want to discuss with you. I don't like applying to the police. If I do, it'll get in the papers, and the whole thing becomes so odious and vulgar. And it's such an exquisite idyll now." He threw back his head. "She's an exquisite idyll, in her way." There, that's what I wanted you to hear you say. I thought you were in love with her. He remembered the pencilled lines in Hans Andersen. It's as you may be in love with an innocent little child. She laughed again wildly, almost hysterically. Oh, Rash, don't try to get that sort of thing off on me. I know how men love innocent little children. You can see the way they do it any night you choose to hang round the stage door of a theatre where the exquisite idols are playing in musical comedy. Don't, Bob. Not when you're talking about her. I know she's an ignorant little thing, but to me she's like a wild flower. Wild flowers can be cultivated, Rash. Yes, but the wild flower she's most like is the one you see in the late summer all along the dusty highways. She put up both palms in a gesture of protestation. Oh, Rash, please don't be poetical. It gets on my nerves. I can't stand it. I like you in every mood but your sentimental one. She came to a halt beside the mantelpiece, on which she rested an elbow, turning to look at him. Now tell me, Rash, suppose I wasn't in the world at all, or suppose you'd never heard of me, and suppose you found yourself married to this girl just as you are, nominally, legally, but not really. Would you make it really? They exchanged a long, silent look. His eyes had not left hers when he said, I might. Good. Now suppose she wasn't in the world at all, or that you'd never heard of her, and suppose that you and I were on just the same terms that we are today. Would you want to marry me? Answer me truly. Why, yes, of course. Now, suppose that she and I were standing together, and you were led in to choose between us, and suppose you were absolutely free and untrammelled in your choice, with no question as to her feelings or mine to trouble you. Which would you take? Answer me just as truly and sincerely as you can. He took time to think, wheeling away from her and walking up and down the little room with his hands behind his back. It occurred to neither that Barbara, having broken the engagement and returned the ring, the choice before him was purely hypothetical. Their relations were no more affected by the note she had written him that morning than by the ceremony through which she and Letty had walked in the previous year. To Barbara, the suspense was almost unbearable. In a minute or two, and with a word or two, she would know how life for the future was to be cast. She would have before her the possibility of some day becoming a happy wife, or a great career like her aunt's. Pausing in his walk, he confronted her just as he stood, his hands still clasped behind his back. Her own attitude, with elbow resting on the mantelpiece, was that of a woman equal to anything. He spoke slowly. Just as truly and sincerely as I can answer you, I don't know. She stirred slightly, but otherwise gave no sign of her impatience. And is there anything that would help you to find out? He shook his head. Nothing that I can think of, unless... Yes, unless what? Unless it's something that would unlock what's locked in my subconsciousness. And what would that be? I haven't the faintest idea. She moved from the mantelpiece with a gesture of despair. Rash, you're absolutely and hopelessly impossible. I know that, he admitted humbly. With both fists clenched, she stood in front of him. I could kill you. He hung his head. Not half so easily as I could kill myself. Letty's judgment on Miss Henrietta Towle was different from yours and mine. She found her just what she had expected to see from the warnings long ago issued by Mrs. Judson Flack in putting her daughter on her guard. In going about the city, she, Letty, was always to be suspicious of elderly ladies, respectably dressed, enticingly mannered, and with what seemed like maternal intentions. The more any one of these traits was developed, the more suspicious Letty was to be. With these instructions carefully at heart, she would have been suspicious of Henrietta Towle in any case, but with Steptoe's description to fall back upon, she couldn't but feel sure. By the time Miss Towle had arrived at the hospital, Letitia Rashleigh had sufficiently recovered to be dressed and seated in the armchair placed beside the bed in the small white ward. On one low bedpost the jacket had been hung, and on the other the battered black hat. "There's nothing the matter with her," the nurse explained to Miss Towle before entering the ward. "She had fainted in the subway, but I think it was only from fatigue and perhaps from lack of food. She's quite well nourished, and she didn't seem to have eaten any supper, and was evidently tired from a long and frightening walk. She gives us no explanation of herself, and is disinclined to talk, and if it hadn't been that she had your address in her pocket—" "I think I know how that she got that. From her name I judged that she's a relative of the family in which I used to be employed, but as they are all very wealthy people—" "Even very wealthy people often have poor relations." "Yes, of course. But I was with this family for so many years, but if there had been any such connection, I think I must have heard of it. However, it makes no difference to me, and I should be glad to be of use to her, especially as she has in her possession an article, a thimble it is, which once belonged to me." At the bedside, the nurse made the introduction. "This is the lady whose address you had in your pocket. She very kindly said she'd come and see what she could do for you." Having placed a chair for Miss Towle, the nurse withdrew to attend to other patients in the ward, of which there were 3 or 4. Letty regarded the newcomer with eyes that seemed lustreless, in spite of their tiny gold flames. Having a shrewd idea of what she would mean to her visitor, she felt it unnecessary to express gratitude. In a certain sense she hated her at sight. She hated her bugles and braid and the shape of her bonnet, as the criminal about to be put to death might hate the executioner's mask and gabardine. The more Miss Towle was sweet-spoken and respectable, the more Letty shrank from these tokens of hypocrisy in one who was wicked to the core. "She wouldn't seem so wicked, not at first," Steptoe predicted, "but time would tell." Well, Letty didn't need time to tell, since she could see for herself already. She could see from the first words addressed to her. "You needn't tell me anything about yourself, dear, that you don't want me to know. If you're without a place to go to, I should be glad if you'll come home with me." It was the invitation Letty had expected, and to which she meant to respond. Knowing, however, what was behind it, she replied more ungraciously than she would otherwise have done. "I don't mind talking about myself. I'm a picture actress, only I've been out of a job. I haven't worked for over 6 months. I've been visiting." Miss Towle lowered her eyes and spoke with modesty. "I suppose you were visiting people who knew the person who gave you my address and the thimble?" The question being more direct than she cared for, Letty was careful to answer no more than "Yes." Miss Towle continued to sit with eyes downcast, as if musing. 2 or 3 minutes went by before she said softly, "How is he?" Letty replied that he was very well, and in the same place where he had been so long. Another interval of musing was followed by the simple statement, "We differed about religion." This remark had no modifying effect on Letty's estimate of Miss Towle's character, since religion was little more to her than a word. Neither was she interested in dead romance between Steptoe and Miss Towle, all romance being summed up in her prince. That flame burned with a pure and single purpose to wed him to the princess with whom he was in love, while the little mermaid became first foam and then a spirit of the air. It took little from the poetry of this dissolution that it could be achieved only by trundling over Brooklyn Bridge and through a nexus of dreary streets. In Letty's outlook on her mission, the end glorified the means, however shady or degraded. It was precisely this spirit, mistaken if you choose to call it so, which animated Judith of Bethulia, Monavenna, and Boule de Suif. Letty didn't class herself with these heroines. She only felt, as they did, that there was something to be done. On that something a man's happiness depended. On it another woman's happiness depended too. On it her own happiness depended. Since it wasn't done, she would feel herself a clog to be cursed. To be cursed by the prince would mean anguish far more terrible than any punishment society could mete out to her. "If you feel equal to it, we might go now, dear," Miss Towle suggested, on waking from her dreams of what might have been. "I wish I could take you in a taxi, but I dare say you won't mind the tram." Letty rose briskly. "No, I shan't mind at all." She looked Miss Towle significantly in the eyes, hoping that her words would carry all the meaning she was putting into them. "I shan't mind. Anything you want me to do, no matter what." Miss Tull smiled sweetly. "Thank you, dear. That'll be very nice. I shan't ask you to do much, because it's your problem, you know, and you must work it out. I'll stand by, but standing by is all about what we can do for each other when problems have to be faced. Don't you think it is?" As this language meant nothing to Letty, she thanked the nurse, smiled at the other patients, and, trudging at Miss Tull's side with her quaintly sturdy grace, went forth to her great sacrifice. Allerton had drawn from his conversation with Barbara this one practical suggestion. As he had months before consulted his lawyer, Mr. Nails, as to ways of losing Letty after she had been found, he might consult him as to ways of finding her now that she had been lost. Mr. Nails would not go to the police. He would apply to some discreet house of detectives who would do the work discreetly. "Then I presume you've changed your mind about this marriage," was Mr. Nails' not unnatural inference. "I mean to go on with it." Not exactly." Allerton was still unable to define his intentions. "I only don't want her to disappear like this." Mr. Nails pondered. He was a tall, raw-boned man of raw-boned countenance, to whom the law represented no system of divine justice, but a means by which Eugene Nails could make money, as his father had made it before him. Having inherited his father's practice, he had inherited Rashleigh Allerton. The two fathers having had a long-standing business connection. Mr. Nails had no high opinion of Rashleigh Allerton, in which he was not peculiar, but a client with so much money was entitled to his way. At the same time, he couldn't have been human without urging a point of common sense. "If you don't want to continue your relation with this lady, doesn't it strike you that now might be a happy opportunity?" Allerton did what he did rarely. He struck the table with his fist. "I want to find her." The words were spoken with so much force that to Mr. Nails they were conclusive. It was far from his intention to compel anyone to common sense, and least of all a man whose folly might bring increased fees to the firm of Nails, Nails, and Nails. It was agreed that steps should be taken at once, and that Mr. Nails would report in the evening. Gravely was the name that Allerton was sure she would use, and the only one that needed to be mentioned. It needed only to be mentioned, too, that Mr. Nails was acting for a client who preferred to remain anonymous. It was further agreed that Mr. Nails should report at Allerton's office at 10 that evening, in person if there was anything to discuss, by telephone if there was nothing. This was convenient for Mr. Nails, who lived in the neighbourhood of Washington Square, while it protected Rash from household curiosity. At 10 that night he was therefore in the unusual position of pacing the rooms he had hardly ever seen except by daylight. Not Letty's disappearance was uppermost in his mind for the moment, but his own inhibitions. "My God, what's the matter with me?" he was muttering to himself. "Am I going insane? Have I been insane all along? Why can't I say which of these two women I want, when I can have either?" He placed over against each other the special set of spells which each threw upon his heart. Barbara was of his own world. She knew the people he knew, she had the same interests, and the same way of showing them. Moreover, she had in a measure grown into his life. Their friendship was not only intimate, it was one of long standing. Though she worried, hectored, and exasperated him, she had fits of generous repentance, in which she mothered him adorably. This double harness of comradeship had worked for so many years that he couldn't imagine wearing it with another. And yet Letty pulled so piteously at his heart that he fairly melted in tenderness toward her. Everything he knew as appeal was summed up in her soft voice, her gentle manner, her humility, her unquestioning faith in himself. No one ever had faith in him before. To Barb he was a booby when he was not a baby. To Letty he was a hero, strong, wise, commanding. It wasn't merely his vanity that she touched, it was his manliness. Barb suppressed his manliness because she herself was so imperious. Letty depended on it, and therefore drew it out. Because she believed him a man, he could be a man. Whereas with Barb, as with everyone else, he was a creature to be liked, humoured, laughed at, and good-naturedly despised. He was sick of being liked, humoured, and laughed at. He rebelled with every atom in him that was masculine at being good-naturedly despised. To find anyone who thought him big and vigorous was to his starved spirit, as the psalmist says, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. In having her weakness to hold up, he could for the first time in his life feel himself of use. If there was no Barb in the world, he could have taken Letty as the mate his soul was longing for. Yet how could he deal with such a blow at Barb's loyalty? She had protected him during all his life, from boyhood upwards. Between him and derision she had stood like a young lioness. How could he deny her now, no matter what frail, gentle hands were clinging round his heart? How can I? How can I? How can I? He was torturing himself with this question when the telephone rang, and he knew that Letty had not been found. No, nothing," were the words of Mr. Nails. "No one of the name has been reported at any of the hospitals, or police stations, or any other public institution. They've applied at all the motion picture studios round New York, but still with no result. This, of course, is only the preliminary search, as much as they've been able to accomplish in one afternoon and evening. You mustn't be disappointed. Tomorrow is likely to be more successful." Rash was, therefore, thrown back on another phase of his situation. Letty was lost. She was not only lost, but she had run away from him. She had not only run away from him, but she had done it so that he might be rid of her. She had not only done it so that he might be rid of her, but... His spirit balked. His imagination could work no further. Horror staggered him. A mother who knows that her child is in the hands of kidnappers who will have no mercy might feel something like the despair and helplessness which sent him chafing and champing up and down the suite of rooms, cursing himself uselessly. Suddenly he paused. He was in front of the cabinet which had come via Bordentown from Queen Caroline Murat. Behind its closed door there was still the bottle, on the label of which a kilted Highlander was dancing. He must have a refuge from his thoughts, or else he would go mad. He was already as near madness as a man could come, and still be reckoned sane. He opened the door of the cabinet. The bottle and the glass stood exactly where he had placed them on the morning when he had tried to begin going to the devil, and had failed. Now there was no longer that same mysterious restraint. He was not thinking of the devil. He was thinking only of himself. He must still the working of his mind. Anything would do that would drug his faculties, and so... It was after midnight when he dragged himself out of a stupor which had not been sleep. Being stupor, however, it was not that much to the good. He had stopped thinking. He couldn't think. His head didn't ache, it was merely sore. As figuratively he had done. His body was sore too, stiff from long sitting in the same posture, and bruised as if from beating. All that was nothing, however, since misery only stunned him. To be stunned was what he had been working for. Out in the air the wind of the May night was comforting. It soothed his nerves without waking the dormant brain. Instead of looking for a taxi, he began walking up the avenue. Walking, too, was a relief. It allowed him to remain as stupefied as at first, and yet stirred the circulation in his limbs. He meant to walk till he grew tired, after which he would jump on an electric bus. But he did not grow tired. He passed the great milestones, 14th Street, 23rd Street, 42nd Street, 59th Street, and not till crossing the last did he begin to feel fagged. He was then so near home that the impulse of doggedness kept him on foot. He was a strong walker and physically in good condition, without being wholly robust. Had it not been for the kilted Highlander, he would hardly have felt fatigue, but, as it was, the corner of East 67th Street found him as spent as he cared to be. Advancing toward his door, he saw a man coming in the other direction. There was nothing in that, and he would scarcely have noticed him, only for the fact that at this hour of the night pedestrians in the quarter were rare. In addition to that, the man, having reached the foot of Allerton's own steps, stood there waiting, as if with intention. Through the obscurity, Rash could only see that the man was well built, flashily dressed, and that he wore a sweeping moustache. In his manner of standing and waiting there was something significant and menacing. Arriving at the foot of the steps, Allerton could do no less than pause to ask if the stranger was looking for anyone. "Is your name Allerton?" "Yes, it is." "Then I want my girl." It was some seconds before Rash could get his dulled mind into play. Moreover, the encounter was of a kind which made him feel sick and disgusted. Whom do you mean?" he managed to ask at last. "You know very well who I mean. I mean Letty Gravely. I'm her father, and by God, if you don't give her up, with big damages—" "I can't give her up. She's not here." "Not here? She was damn well here the day before yesterday." "Yes, she was here the day before yesterday, but she disappeared last night." "Ah, cut that kind of talk. I'm wise, I am. You can't put that bunk over on me. She's in there, and I'm going to get her." "I wish she was in there, but she's not." "How do I know she's not?" "I'm afraid you'll have to take my word for it." "Like hell I'll take your word for it. I've got to see for myself." "I don't see how you're going to do that." "I'm going in with you." "That wouldn't do you any good. Besides, I can't let you." The man became more bullying. "See here, son, this game is my game. Did you ever see a thing like this?" Watching the movement of his hand, Rash saw the handle of a revolver displayed in a side pocket. "Yes, I've seen a thing like that, but even if it was loaded, which I don't believe it is, you've too much sense to use it. You might shoot me, of course, but you wouldn't find the girl in the house because she isn't there." "Well, I'm going to see. You march. Up you go, and open that door, and I'll follow you." "Oh, no, you won't." Allerton looked round for the policeman who occasionally passed that way, but though a lighted car crashed down Madison Avenue, there was no one in sight. He might have called in the hope of waking the men upstairs, but that seemed cowardly. Though in a physical encounter with a ruffian like this he could hardly help getting the worst of it, especially in his state of half-intoxication, it was the encounter itself that he loathed even more than the defeat. "Oh, no, you won't," he repeated, taking one step upward and turning to defend his premises. "I don't mean that you shall come into this house or ever see the girl again, if I can prevent it." "Oh, you don't, do you?" "No, I don't." "Then take that!" The words were so quickly spoken and the blow in his face so unexpected that Rash staggered backwards. Being on a step, he had little or no footing, and having been drinking, his balance was the more quickly lost. "And that!" A second blow in the face sent him down like a stone without a struggle or a cry. He fell limply on his back, his feet slipping to the sidewalk, his body sagging on the steps like a bit of string accidentally dropped there. The hat, which fell off, remained on the step beside the head it had been covering. The man leaped backward as if surprised at his own deed. He looked this way and that to see if he had been observed. A lighted car crashed up Madison Avenue, but otherwise the street remained empty. Creeping near the steps, he bent over his victim, whose left hand lay helpless and outstretched. Timidly, gingerly, he put his fingers to the pulse, starting back from it with a shock. He spoke but 2 words, but he spoke them half aloud. "Dead! God!" Then he walked swiftly away into Madison Avenue, where he soon found a car going southward. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Dust Flower by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. Barbara was late for breakfast. Miss Walbrook, the aunt, was scanning the morning paper, her refined, austere Americanism being as noticeable in the dining-room as elsewhere in the house. Everything was slender and strong. Everything was American, unless it was the Persian rug. On the panelled walls there were but 3 portraits, a Boston ancestress in lace cap and satins, painted by Copley, a Philadelphia ancestor in the Continental uniform, painted by Gilbert Stuart, and her New York grandmother, painted by Thomas Sully, looking over her shoulder with the wild backward glance that an artist gives to the girl Victoria in the Metropolitan Museum. In a flat cabinet along a wall was the largest collection of old American glass to be found in the country. Barbara rushed in with apologies for being late. "I didn't sleep a wink. It doesn't seem to me as if I should ever sleep again. Where's my cup?" "Wild Goose will bring it." As the coffee had grown cold, he took that and the cup to keep warm. "What's the matter?" Wild Goose stepped in with the missing essentials. A full-fed, round-faced, rubicund man of 50-odd, he looked a perennial 25. Barbara began to minister to herself. "Oh, everything's the matter. I told you yesterday that girl had run away. Well, I begin to wish she'd run back again." Miss Walbrook, the elder, had this in common with Miss Henrietta Tull, that she believed it best for everyone to work out his own salvation. Barbara had her personal life to live, and while her aunt would help her to live it, she wouldn't guide her choice. She continued, therefore, to scan the paper till her niece should say something more. She said it, not because she wanted to give information, but because she was temperamentally outspoken. "I begin to wish there were no men in the world. If women are men in a higher stage of development, why didn't men die out so that we could be rid of them? Isn't that what we generally get from the survival of the fittest?" Miss Walbrook's thin, clear smile suggested the edge of a keenly tempered blade. "I've never said that women were men in a higher stage of development. I've said that in their parallel states of development women have advanced a stage beyond men. You may say of every generation born that women begin where men leave off. I suppose that's what's meant by the myth of Eve springing from Adam's side. It was to be noticed even then, in the prehistoric, in the age that formed the great legends. Adam was asleep when Eve as a vital force leaped away from him. If it wasn't for Eve's vitality, the human race would still be in the Stone Age." Barbara harked back to what for her was the practical. "Some of us are in the Stone Age as it is. I'm sure Rashleigh Allerton is as nearly an elemental as one can be, and still belongs to clubs and drives in motor cars." Miss Walbrook risked her principles of non-interference so far as to say, "It's part of our feminine lack of development that we're always inclined to look back on the elemental with pity and even with regret. The woman was never born who didn't have in her something of Lot's wife." "Thank you, Aunt Marion. In a way that lets me out. If I'm no weaker than the rest of my sex—" "Than many of the rest of your sex?" "Very well, then, than many of the rest of my sex. If I'm no weaker than that, I don't have to lose my self-respect." "You don't have to lose your self-respect. You only risk your reason." Barbara stared at her. "That's the very thing I'm afraid of. I'd give anything for peace of mind. How did you know?" "Oh, it doesn't call for much astuteness. I don't suppose there's a married woman in the world in full command of her wits. You've noticed how foolish most of them are. That's why. It isn't that they were born foolish. They've simply been addled by enforced adaptation to mates of lower intelligence. Oh, I'm not scolding. I'm merely stating a natural, observed psychological fact. The woman who marries says goodbye to the orderly working of her faculties. For that she may get compensations with which I don't intend to find fault. But compensations or no, to a clear-thinking woman like yourself, Aunt Marion. Very well, like myself, if you will. But to a clear-thinking woman it's as obvious as daylight that her married sisters are partially demented. They may not know it. The partially demented never do. And it's no good telling them, because they don't believe you. I'm only saying it to you to warn you in advance. If you part with your reason, it's something to know that you do it of your own free will." Once more Barbara confined herself to the case in hand. "Still, I don't believe every man is as trying as Rashleigh Allerton." "Not in his particular way, perhaps, but if it's not in one way, then it's in another. Even he wouldn't be so bad if he could control himself. At the minute when he's tearing down the house, he wants you to tell him that he's calm. If he didn't want you to tell him that, it would be something equally preposterous. There's little to choose between men." Barbara grew thoughtful. "Still, if people didn't marry, the human race would die out." "And would there be any harm in that?" "Not a danger, of course, but if it was, would anyone in his senses want to stop it? Looking round on the human race today, one can hardly help saying that the sooner it dies out, the better. Since we can't kill it off, it's well to remember—" "To remember what, Aunt Marion?" Miss Walbrook reflected as to how to express herself cautiously. To remember that in marrying and having children, children who will have to face the highly probable miseries of the next generation, well, I'm glad there'll be no one to reproach me with his being in the world, either as his mother or his ancestresses. They say Rashleigh's father and mother didn't want him in the world, and I sometimes wish they'd had their way. If he wasn't here, or if he was dead, I believe I could be happier. I shouldn't be forever worrying about him. I shouldn't have him on my mind. I often wonder if it's love I feel for him, or only an agonizing sense of responsibility. The door being open, Walter Wildgoose waddled to the threshold, where he stood with his right hand clasped in his left. Mr. Steptoe, Mr. Allerton, to speak to Miss Barbara on the telephone, please. Barbara gasped. Oh, Lord, I wonder what it is now. Left to herself, Miss Walbrook resumed her scanning of the paper, but she resumed it with the faintest quiver of a smile on her thin and cleanly cut lips. It was the kind of smile which indicates patient hope, or the anticipation of something satisfactory. Oh! The exclamation was so loud as to be heard all the way from the telephone, which was in another part of the house. Miss Walbrook let the paper fall, sat bolt upright, and listened. Oh! Oh! It was like a second and repeated explosion. Miss Walbrook rose to her feet. The paper rustled to the floor. Oh! Oh! The sound was that which human beings make when the things told them is more than they can bear. Barbara cried out as if someone was beating her with clubs, and she was coming to her knees. She was not coming to her knees. When her aunt reached her, she was still standing by the little table in the hall which held the telephone, on which she had hung up the receiver. She supported herself with one hand on the table, as a woman does when all she can do is not to fall senseless. It's Rash, she panted, as she saw her aunt appear. Somebody has killed him. Miss Walbrook stood with hands clasped like one transfixed. He's dead, after all? Barbara nodded tearlessly. She could stammer out the words, but no more. Yes, all but... In the flat at Red Point, there was another and dissimilar breakfast scene. For the first time in her life, Letty was having coffee and toast in bed. The window was open, and between the muslin curtains, which puffed in the soft May wind, she could see the ocean with steamers and ships on it. The room was tiny, but it was spotless. Everything was white, except where here and there it was tied up with a baby blue ribbon. Anything that could be tied with a baby blue ribbon was so tied. Letty thought she had never seen anything so dainty, though her experienced eye could detect the fact that nothing had really cost money. As an opening to the career on which she had embarked, the setting was unexpected, while the method of her treatment was bewildering. In the black recesses of her heart, Miss Henrietta Tull might be hiding all those feline machinations which Mrs. Judson Flack had led Letty to believe a part of the great world's stock in trade. But it couldn't be denied that she hid them well. Letty didn't know what to make of it. There's quite a trick to it, Steptoe had warned her, but the explanation seemed inadequate to the phenomena. Sipping her coffee and crunching her toast, she was driven to ponder on the ways of wickedness. She had expected them to be more obvious. All her information was to the effect that an unprotected girl in a world of males was a lamb among lions, a victim with no way of escape. That she was a lamb among lions, and a victim with no way of escape, she was still prepared to believe. Only the preliminaries puzzled her. Instead of being crude, direct, indelicate, they were subtle and misleading. After 24 hours in Miss Tull's spare room, there was still no hint of anything but coddling. You see, my dear, Miss Tull had said, if I don't nurse you back to real health, him that gave you the thimble might be displeased with me. It was not often that Miss Tull dropped an H or added one, but in moments of emotion, early habit was too strong for her. Coming into the room now on some ermine's errand of neatness, she threw a glance at Letty and said, You don't look like a Rashleigh, do you, dear? But then you never can tell anything about families from looks, can you? It was her nearest approach as yet to the personal, and Letty considered as to how she was to meet it. I'm not a Rashleigh, not really, only by marriage. Rashleigh isn't my real name. It's the name I'm going by in the pictures." "Oh." Miss Towell's exclamation was the subdued one of acquiescence. She knew that ladies in pictures often preferred names other than their own, and if Letty was not a Rashleigh, it explained things. That is, it explained how anyone called Rashleigh could be wandering about in this friendless way, though it made Henry Steptoe's intervention the more mysterious. It was conceivable that he might act on behalf of a genuine Rashleigh, however out at elbow, but that he should take such pains for a spurious one, and go to the length of sending the sacred silver thimble as a pledge, rendered the situation puzzling. Schooled by her religious precepts to taking her duties as those of a minute at a time, Miss Towell made no effort to force the girl's confidence, and especially since Letty, like most young people in trouble, was on her guard against giving it. So long as she preferred to be shut up within herself she should remain. Miss Towell felt that, for the moment at least, her own responsibility was limited to making the child feel that someone cared for her. At the same time, she couldn't have been a lonely woman with a love story behind her without the impulse to dwell a little longingly on the one romantic incident in her experience. Though it had never come to anything, the fact that it had once opened its shy little flower made a sweet, bright place to which her thoughts could retire. The references came spasmodically and without context, as the little white lady busied herself in waiting on Letty or in the care of her room. "I haven't seen him since a short time after the mistress went away." Letty felt herself colouring. Though not prudish, there were words she couldn't get used to. Besides which, she had never thought that Steptoe. But Miss Towell pursued her memories. "It's always worried him that I should hold views different from his, but I couldn't submit to dictation, now could I, dear?" Once more Letty felt herself awkwardly placed. The only interpretation she could put on Miss Towell's words referring to moral reformation on her hostess's part, she said, as non-committally as might be, "He's a good deal of a stickler. He's been so long in a high position that he's become, well, I won't be harsh, but he's become a little arbitrary. That's where it was. He was a little arbitrary. With a mistress who's allowed him a great deal of his own way, well, you can hardly blame him, can you, dear?" Letty forced herself to accept the linguistic standard of the world. "I suppose if she hadn't allowed him a great deal of his own way, he'd have looked somewhere else." "That he could easily have done. He had temptations enough, a man like him. Why, dear, there was a lady in Park Avenue who did everything she could that wasn't positively dishonourable to win him away." "He must have been younger and better looking than he is now," Letty hazarded bluntly. "Oh, it wasn't a question of looks. Of course, if she considered that, why, any foolish young fellow. But you knew what she would have got." Not being at her ease in this kind of conversation, and finding the effort to see Steptoe as Lothario difficult, Letty became blunt again. "He must have had an awful crush on the first one." "It wasn't her exactly, it was the boy." "Oh, there was a boy?" "Why, of course, dear, didn't you know that?" "Whose boy was it?" "Why, the mistress's boy, but I don't think he—" Letty understood the pronoun as applying to Steptoe. "I don't think he ever realized that he wasn't his very own." Straightening the white cover on the chest of drawers, Miss Towell shook her head. "It was a sad case." "What made it sad?" "Lovely boy he was. Had a kind word for everyone, even for the cat. But somehow his father and mother, well, they were people of the world, and they hadn't wanted a child. And when he came, and he's so delicate always, I could have cried over him." Letty's heart began to swell. Her lip trembled. "I know someone like that myself." "Do you, dear? Then I'm sure you understand." Partly because the minute was emotional, and partly from a sense that she needed to explain herself, Letty murmured more or less indistinctly, "It's on his account that I'm here." Failing to see the force of this, Miss Towell was content to say, "I'm glad you were led to me, dear. There's always a power to shepherd us along, if we'll only let ourselves be guided." To Letty, the moment had arrived when plainness of speech was imperative. Leaning across the tray, which still stood on her lap, She gazed up at her hostess with eager, misty eyes. "He said you'd teach me all the ropes." Miss Towle paused beside the bed to look inquiringly at the tense little face. "The ropes of what, dear?" "Of what—" it was hard to express. "Of what you used to be yourself. You don't seem to like it now," she added desperately, "but you were, weren't you?" "Oh, that!" The surprise was in the discovery that an American girl of Letty's age could entertain so sensible a purpose. "Why, of course, dear, I'll tell you all I know, and welcome." "There's quite a trick to it, isn't there?" "Well, it's more than a trick. There are 2 or 3 things which you simply have to be." "Oh, I know that. That's what frightens me." "You needn't be afraid once you've made up your mind to it." She leaned above the bed to relieve Letty of the tray. "For instance, you don't mind my asking questions, do you?" "Oh, no, you can ask me anything." "Then the first thing is this. Are you pretty good as a needlewoman?" Letty was astounded. Why, you don't have to sew, do you?" "Certainly, dear. That's one of the most important things you'd be called on to do. You'd never get anywhere if you weren't quick with your needle and thread. And then there'll be hairdressing. You have to know something about that. I don't say that you must be a professional, but for the simpler occasions. After that, there's packing. That's something we often overlook, and where French girls have us at a disadvantage. They pack so beautifully." Letty was entirely at sea. "Pack what?" "Pack trunks, dear." "What for?" "For travel, from moving from town to country, or from country to town, or making visits. You see, you're always on the go." "Oh, it's more than a trick. It's quite an art. Only—" She smiled at Letty as she stood holding the tray before carrying it out. "Only I shouldn't have supposed you'd be thinking of that when you act in moving pictures." I thought I might do both." "Now, I should say that that's one thing you couldn't do, dear. If you took up this at all, you'd find it so absorbing." "And you're very unhappy too, aren't you? I've always heard you were." "Well, that would depend a good deal on yourself. There's nothing in the thing itself to make you unhappy, but sometimes there are other women." Letty's eyes were flaming. "They say they're awful." "Oh, not always. It's a good deal as you carry yourself. I made it a point to keep my position and respect the position of others. It wasn't always easy, especially with Mary Ann Courage and Janey Cakebread, but—" Letty's head fell back on the pillow. Her eyes closed. A merry-go-round was spinning in her head. Where was she? How had she come here? What was she there for? Where was the wickedness she'd been told to look for everywhere? Having gone in search of it and expected to find it lying in wait from the first minute of passing the protected door, she'd been shuffled along from one to another with exasperating kindness, only to be brought face to face with Jane Cakebread and Mary Ann Courage at the end. Miss Towle having borne away the tray, Letty struggled out of bed and put on the woollen dressing-gown thrown over her chair by the bedside. This was no place for her. Beehive Valley was not far off, and her 45 cents would more than suffice to take her there. She would see the casting director. She would get a job. With food to eat and a place to sleep as a starting point, she would find her own way to wickedness, releasing the prince in spite of all the mishaps which kept her as she was. But she trembled, so that having wrapped the dressing-gown about her, she was obliged to sit down again. She would have to be crafty. She must get this woman to help her with her dressing, without suspecting what she meant to do. How could she manage that? She must try to think. She was trying to think when she heard the ring of the telephone. It suggested an idea. Sometime, not this time, of course, when the telephone rang and the woman was answering it, she, Letty, would be able to slip away. The important thing was to do her hair and get her clothes on. "Yes? Yes?" There was a little catch to the breath, a smothered laugh, a smothered sigh. "Oh, so this is you. Yes, I got it. Seeing it again gave me quite a turn. I never expected that you'd keep it all this time, but— Yes, she's here. No, she didn't come exactly of her own accord, but I found her. I could tell you about it easier if you were— It's so hard on the telephone when there's so much to say, but perhaps you don't care to—" Yes, she's quite well, only a little tired, been worked up somehow. But a day or so in bed. Oh, very sensible. And she wants me to teach her how to be a lady's maid. So that was it. Steptoe had been treacherous. Letty would never believe in anyone again. She could make these reflections hurriedly because the voice at the telephone was silent. Oh! It was the same exclamation as that of Barbara Walbrook, but in another tone, a tone of distress, sharp, sympathetic. Pulling the dressing-gown about her, frightened, tense, Letty knew that something had gone wrong. Oh! Oh! Last night, did you say? Early this morning? Letty crept to where her hostess was seated at the telephone. What is it? But Miss Dowell either didn't hear the question or was too absorbed to answer it. Oh, Henry, try to remember that God is his life, that there can't be no death to be afraid of when... Letty snatched the receiver from the other woman's hands and fell on her knees beside the little table. Oh, what is it? What is it? It's me, Letty. Something's happened. I've got to know. Amazed and awed by the force of this intrusion, Miss Dowell stood up and moved a little back. Over the wire, Steptoe's voice sounded to Letty like the ghost of his voice, broken, dead. I think if I was madam, I'd come back. But what's happened? Tell me that first. It's Mr. Rash. Yes, I know it's Mr. Rash, but what is it? Tell me quickly, for God's sake. He's been hit. Her utterance was as nearly as possible a cry. But he hasn't been killed. Madam will find him alive, if she hurried. When Letty rose from her knees, she was strong. She was calm, too, and competent. She further surprised Miss Dowell by the way in which she took command. I must hurry. They want me at once. Would you mind helping me to dress? End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Dust Flower by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 25. The queer thing about it, miss, Steptoe was saying to Barbara, is that I didn't hear no noise. My window is just above the front door, 2 floors up, and it was open. Always like an open window, especially when the weather begins to get warm. Makes it healthier like, and so... Yes, but just tell me how he is. That's what I'm coming to, miss. The minute I see what an awful state we was in, I says, Miss Walbrook, she'll have to know, I says. And so I called up. Well, as I was a-telling you, miss, I couldn't sleep all night, hardly not any, thinking of all what had happened in the house in the course of a few months, as you might say. And Madam run away, and Mr. Rash, he not home, and it 1 o'clock and later. Not but what he's often later than that. Only last night I had that kind of a feeling which you'll get when you know things is not right, and you don't hardly know how you know it. Yes, Steptoe, she interposed eagerly, but is he conscious now? That's what I wants to hear about. Steptoe's expression of grief lay in working up to a dramatic climax dramatically. He didn't understand the hurried leaps and bounds by which you took the tragic on the skip, as if it were not portentous. In his response to Miss Walbrook there was a hint of irritation, and perhaps of rebuke. I couldn't say what he is now, miss, as the doctor and the nurse is with him, and won't let nobody in till they decide whether he's to live or die. Rocking himself back and forth in his chair, he moaned in stricken anticipation. If he goes, I shan't be long after him. I may linger a bit, but the good Lord won't move me on too soon. Barbara curbed her impatience to reach the end, going back to the beginning. Well then, was it you who found him? Him? It was this way, miss. Knowing he wasn't in the house, I kept going to my window and listening, and then going back to bed again. I couldn't tell you how many times. And then, if you believe it, I must have fell asleep. No, I can't believe as I was asleep. I just seemed to come to like, and as I lay there wondering what time it was, seems to me as if I heard a kind of a snore like, not in the house, but coming up from the street. What time was that? That'd be about 1:30. Well, up I gets and creeps to the window, and sure enough, the snore come right up from the steps. Seems to me, too, I could see something laying there, all up and down the steps, just as if it had been dropped by accident like. My blood freezes. I slips into my thick dressing-gown. No, it was my thin dressing-gown. I always keeps two, one for winter and one for summer, and this spring being so early like. But in the end you got downstairs. If I didn't, miss, how could I have found him? I ain't one to be afraid of danger, not even here in New York, where you can be robbed and murdered without hardly knowing it, and the police that slow about following up a clue. And what happened when you opened the front door? I didn't open it at once, miss. I put my ear to the crack and listened, and there it was, a long kind of snore like. Only it wasn't just what you call a snore, it was more like this. He drew a deep, rasping, stertorous breath. Awful it was, miss, just like somebody in liquor. It's liquor, I says, and not wanting to be mixed up in no low company, I wasn't for opening the door at all. But you did. Not till I'd gone half-way upstairs and down again. I'm like that. I often thinks I'll not do a thing, and then I'll sigh to myself, now perhaps I'd better. And so it was that time. He's out, I says, and who knows but what he's fell in a faint like. So back I goes, and I peeps out a little bit, just my nose out, as you might say, not knowing what if there was a low company. When did you find out who it was? Why, I know the hat, like. It was that hat what he bought after he bought the last one. No, I don't know but what he's bought two since he bought that one. A soft felt, and a cowboy what he never wore but once or twice because it wasn't becoming. You'll have noticed, miss, that he had one of them faces what don't look well in nothing rakish. A real gentleman's face he had, and them cowboy hats. Well, when you saw that hat, what did you do? For quite a spell I didn't do nothing. I was all blood-curdled, as you might say. But by and by I creeps out and down the steps, and there he was, all huddled up every way. His lip trembled. In trying to go on, he produced only a few incoherent sounds. Reaching for his handkerchief, he blew his nose before being able to say more. Well, the first thing I says to myself, miss, was, is he dead? It was a terrible thing to sigh of one that's everything in the world to me, but seeing him there all crumpled up with one leg one way and the other leg another way, and an arm thrown out helpless like, well, what was I to think, miss? And him not able to say a word, and me shaking like a leaf, and out of doors in my thin dressing gown. If I'd had my thick one, I wouldn't have felt so kind of shameful like. You might have known he wasn't dead when you heard him breathing. I didn't think of that. I thought as he was. When I see his poor arm stretched out so wild like, I creeps nearer and nearer, and me hardly able to move. I felt so bad. And I puts my finger on his pulse. Might as well have put it on that there fender. Then I looks at his face, and I see blood on his lip and his cheek. Something struck him, I said, and then I just loses consciousness, and puts back me head, as you'll say a dog do when he howls, and I yells, "Police!" Oh, you did that, did you? I'm ashamed to say it, miss, but I did. And who should come running along but the policeman what in the night goes up and down our beat. By that time I've got my hand on his heart, and the policeman, he calls out from a distance, "Hi there, what are you doing to that man?" Thought I was murdering him, you see. I says, "My boy he is, and I'm trying to save his life." Well, the policeman, he sees I'm in my dressing gown and don't look as if I'd do him any harm, so he kind of picks up his courage and blows his whistle, and another policeman, he runs up from the way of the avenue. Then when there's two of them, they ain't afraid no more, so that the first one, he comes up to me quite bold-like and asks me who's killed and what's killed him. And I tells him how I was laying awake with the window open, and Mr. Ash being out I couldn't sleep like. How long did they let him lie there? Oh, not long. First there was a for calling an ambulance, but when I tells them that he's my boy and lives in my house, they brings him in and we lays him on the sofa in the library, and I rings up Dr. Lansing and... But something in Barbara snapped. She could stand no more. Not to cry out or break down, she sprang to her feet. "That'll do, Steptoe. I know now all I needs to know. Thank you for telling me. I shall stay here till the doctor or the nurse comes down. If I want you again, I'll ring." Lashing up and down the drawing-room, wringing her hands and moaning awkwardly, Barbara reflected on the speed with which Nemesis had overtaken her. "If he wasn't here, or if he was dead," she'd said, "I believe I could be happier." As long as she lived, she would hear the curious intonation in Aunt Marian's voice. "He's dead, after all?" It was in that "after all" that she read the unspeakable accusation of herself. Waiting for the doctor was not long. On hearing his step on the stair, Barbara went out to meet him. "How is he?" she asked, without wasting time over self-introductions. It's a little difficult to say as yet. The case is serious. Just how serious we can't tell today. Perhaps not tomorrow. I find no trace of fracture of the cranium or of laceration of the brain, but it's too soon to be sure. Dr. Brace and Dr. Wisdom, who've both been here, are inclined to think that it may be no more than a simple concussion. We must wait and see. Relieved to this extent, Barbara went on to explain herself. I'm Miss Walbrook. I was engaged to Mr. Allerton till quite recently. We're still great friends, the greatest friends. He had no near relations, only cousins, and I doubt if any of them are in New York as late in the season as this, and even if they are, he hardly knows them. The doctor, a cheery, robust man in the late 30s, in his own line one of the ablest specialists in New York, had a foible for social proposition, and his success in it. Even now, with such grave news to communicate, he couldn't divest himself of his dinner-party manner or his smile. "I've had the pleasure of meeting Miss Walbrook at the Eastons' dinner, the big one for Isabel, and afterwards at the dance." "Oh, of course," Barbara corroborated, though with no recollection of the encounter. "I knew it was somewhere, but I couldn't quite recall. So I felt when the butler called me up that I should be here." "Quite so, quite so. You'll find Miss Galliffer, who is with him now, a most competent nurse, and I shall bring a good night nurse before evening." The professional side of the situation disposed of, he touched tactfully on the romantic. "It will be a great thing for me to know that in a masculine household like this, a woman with knowledge and authority is running in and out. The more you can be here, Miss Walbrook, the more responsibility you'll take off my hands. May I be in his room and help the nurse, or do anything like that?" "Quite so, quite so. I'm sure Miss Galliffer, who can't be there every minute of the time, you understand, will be glad to feel that there's someone she can trust. And he couldn't know I was there?" "Not unless he returned unexpectedly to consciousness, which is possible, you understand." Her distress was so great that she hazarded a question on which she would not otherwise have ventured. "Doctor, you're a physician. I can speak to you as I shouldn't speak to everyone. Suppose he did return unexpectedly to consciousness and found me there in the room. Do you think he'd be annoyed?" It was the sort of situation he liked, a part in the intimate affairs of people of the first quality. As to his being annoyed, I can't say. It might be the very opposite. What I know is this, that in the coming back of the mind to its regular functions, inhibitions are often suspended." "And you mean by that?" "That the first few minutes in which the mind revives are likely to be minutes of genuine reality. I don't say that the mind could keep it up. Very few of us can be our genuine selves for more than flashes at a time. But a returning consciousness doesn't put on its inhibition still, so that what you see in those few minutes you can take as the truth. I should say so. I'm not in a position to affirm it, but the probabilities point that way. And if there had been, let us say, a lesser affection, something of recent origin and lower in every way, I think that until it forged its influence again, if it ever did, you'd see it forgotten or disowned." She tried to be even more explicit. "He's perfectly free in every way. I broke off my engagement just to make him free. The other woman, she too has left him. So that," he summed up, "if in those first instants of returning to the world you could read his choice, you'd be relieved of doubts for the future." Having made one or two small professional recommendations, he was about to go when Barbara's mind worked to another point. "You know, he's been very excitable." "So I've understood. I go a good deal to the Chancellor's. You know them, of course. I've heard about him there." "Well, then, if he got better, is there anything we could do about that?" In a general way, yes, if you're gentle with him." "Oh, I am." "And if you try to smooth him down when you see him beginning to be ruffled." "That's just what I do, and it seems to excite him the more." "Then in that case I should say break the conversation off. Go away from him. Let him alone. Let him work out of it. Begin again later." "Yes, only—" She was wistful, unconvinced. "Only later it's so likely to be the same thing over again." He dodged the further issue by running up to explain to the nurse Miss Walbrook's position in the house, and as helper in case of necessity. By the time he had come down again, Barbara's anguish was visible. "Oh, Doctor, you think he will get better, don't you?" He was at the front door. I hope he will. Quite possibly he will. His pulse isn't very strong as yet, but, well, Dr. Brace and Dr. Wisdom are coming for another consultation this afternoon. Only his condition, you understand, is, well, serious. Barbara divined the malice beneath Steptoe's indications as he conducted her upstairs. That was the light Mrs. Allerton's room. That's the front spare room, and that's our present madam's room when she's here, each with its bath. I'm sure if Miss Walbrook was inclined to use the front spare room, I'd be entirely welcome and have put in clean towels and everything a purpose. When Rashleigh's door was pointed out to her, she tapped. Miss Galliffer opened it, receiving her colleague with a great, big, hearty smile. Great, big, and hearty were the traits by which Miss Galliffer was known among the doctors. Healthy, skilful, jolly, and off-hand, she carried the issues of life and death, in which she was at home, with a lightness which made her easy to work with. Some nurses would have resented the intrusion of an outsider, professionally speaking, like Miss Walbrook, but to Miss Galliffer it was the more the merrier, even in the sick-room. The very fact of coming to close quarters with the type she knew as a society girl added spice to the association. For the first few seconds Barbara found her breeziness a shock. She had expected something subdued, hushed, funereal. Miss Galliffer hardly lowered her voice, which was naturally loud, or quieted her manner, which, when off duty, could be boisterous. It was not boisterous now, of course, only quick, free, spontaneous. Then Barbara saw the reason. There was no need to lower the voice or quiet the manner or soften the swish of rustling to and fro, in presence of that still, white form composed in the very attitude of death. If Barbara hadn't known he was alive, she wouldn't have supposed it. She'd seen dead men before, her father, 2 brothers, other relatives. They looked like this looked like them. She said this to herself and not he, because it seemed the word. But by the time she had moved forward and was standing by the bed, Miss Galliffer's businesslike tone became a comfort. You couldn't take such a tone if you thought there was danger, and in spite of the hemming and hawing of the doctors, Miss Galliffer didn't think there was. "Oh, I've seen lots of such cases, and I say it's a simple concussion. Old Wisdom, he doesn't know anything. I wouldn't consult him about an accident to a cat. A laceration of the brain is always his first diagnosis, and if the patient didn't have it, he'd get it to him before he'd admit that he was wrong." Barbara put the question in which all her other questions were enfolded. "Then you think you'll get better?" "Oh, I shouldn't be surprised." "Would you be surprised the other way?" "I think I should, on the whole. Pulse is poor. That's the worst sign." She picked up the hand lying outside the coverlet and put her fingertips to the wrist, doing it with the easy, nonchalant carelessness with which she might have seized an inanimate object, yet knowing exactly what she was about. 56, that's pretty low. If we could get it above 60, but still." Dropping the hand with the same indifference, yet continuing to know what she was about, Miss Galliffer tossed aside the index of the pulse as wholly non-convincing. "I've known cases where the pulse would go down till there was almost no pulse at all, and yet it would come up again." "So that you feel—" "Oh, he'll do. I shouldn't worry yet. If he wasn't going to pull through, there would be something. Something to tell you?" "Well, yes, if you put it that way. I most always know with a patient. It isn't anything in his condition, it's more like a hunch. There's often the difference between a doctor and a nurse. The doctor goes by what he sees, the nurse by what she feels. 9 times out of 10 the doctor will see wrong and the nurses will feel right, and there you are. You can't go by doctors. A lot of guesswork gumps, I often think, yet the laity needs them for comfort." Making the most of all this, Barbara asked timidly, "Is there anything I could do?" "Well, no, there isn't much that anyone can do. You've just got to wait. If you're going to stay, I should like to, then you can be somewhere else in the house so that I could call you, or you could sit right here, whichever you preferred." "I'd rather sit right here if I shouldn't be in the way." "Oh, when you're in the way, I'll tell you." On this understanding, Barbara sat down in a small low armchair not far from the foot of the bed. Miss Galliffer also sat down nearer to the window, taking up a book which, as Barbara could see from the jacket on the cover, bore the title, "The Secret of Violet Pride." It was clear that there was nothing to be done, since Miss Galliffer could so easily lose herself in her novel. Not until her jumble of impressions began to arrange themselves did Barbara realize that she was in Rashleigh's room, surrounded by the objects most intimate to his person. Here the poor boy slept and dressed and lived the portion of his life which no one else could share with him. In a sense they were rifling his privacy, the secret with which every human being has in some measure to surround himself. She recalled a day in her childhood, after her parents and both her brothers had died, when their house with its contents was put up for sale. She remembered the horror with which she had seen strangers walking about in the rooms sanctified by loved presences and endeared to her holiest memories. Something of that she felt now, as Miss Galliffer threw aside her book, sprang lightly to her feet, hurried into Rash's bathroom, and came out with a towel slightly damped, which she passed over the patient's brow. She was so horribly at ease. It was as if Rash no longer had a personality whose rights one must respect. But he might get better. Miss Galliffer believed that he would. Barbara clung to that as an anchor in this tempest of emotions. If he got better, he would open his eyes. If he opened his eyes, it would be, for a little while at least, with his inhibitions suspended. If his inhibitions were suspended, the thing he most wanted would be in his first glance, and if his first glance fell on her... End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Dust Flower by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 26. Waiting was becoming dreamlike. She didn't find it tedious or overfraught with suspense. On the contrary, it was soothing. It was a little trance-like, too, enwrapped in Rash's stillness. It was so strange to see him still. It was so strange to be still herself. Of her own being, as of his, she had hardly any concept apart from the high winds of excitement. Calm like this was new to her, and because new, it was appeasing, wonderful. It was not unlike content, only the content which comes in sleep, to be broken up by waking. Somewhere in her nature she liked seeing him as he was, helpless, inert, with no power of enraging her by being restive to her will. It was, in its way, a repetition of what she had said that morning, if he wasn't here, or if he was dead. Longing for peace, her stormy soul seemed to know by instinct the price she would have to pay for it. For peace to be possible, Rash must pass out of her life, and the thought of Rash passing out of her life was agony. While Miss Galliffer was downstairs at lunch, Barbara had the sweet, unusual sensation of having him all to herself. She had never so had him in their hours together, because the violence of their clashes had prevented communion. Seated in this silence, in this quietude, she felt him hers. There was no one to dispute her claim, no one whose claim she had in any way to recognize as superior. Letty's claim she had never recognized at all. It was accidental, spurious. Letty herself didn't put it forth, and even she was gone. If Rash were to open his eyes, he would see no one but herself. She was sorry when Miss Galliffer came back, though there was no help for that. But Miss Galliffer was obtrusive only when she chatted or moved about. For much of the time she pursued the secret of violent pride with such assiduity that the room became quiescent, and communion with Rash could be re-established. The awesome silence was disturbed only by the turning of Miss Galliffer's pages. It might have been 3 o'clock. Once more Barbara was lost in the unaccustomed hush, her eyes fixed on the white face on the pillow in almost hypnotic restfulness. The pushing open of the door behind was so soft that she didn't notice. Miss Galliffer turned another page. It was the sense that someone was in the room which made Barbara glance over her shoulder and Miss Galliffer look up. A little grey figure in a battered black hat stood just within the door. She stood just within the door, but with no consciousness of anything or anyone in the room. She saw only the upturned face and its death-like fixity. With slow, spellbound movement she began to come forward. Barbara, who had never seen the Letty who used to be, knew her now only by a terrified intuition. Miss Galliffer was entirely at a loss and somewhat indignant. The little grey vagrant was not of the type she had been used to treating with respect. "What are you doing here?" she asked quickly as soon as speech came to her. Letty didn't look at her, or remove her eyes from the face on the pillow. A woman in a trance could not have spoken with greater detachment or self-control. "I came to see." "Well, now that you've seen, won't you please go away before I call the police?" Of this Letty took no notice, going straight to the bedside, while Miss Galliffer moved towards Barbara, who stood as she had risen from her chair. "Do you know who she is?" Miss Galliffer asked, with curiosity greater than her indignation. Barbara nodded. "Yes, I know who she is. I thought she'd disappeared." "Oh, they never disappear for long, not that kind. What had I better do? Is she anything to him?" Barbara was saved the necessity of answering, because Letty, who was on the other side of the bed, bent over and kissed the feet, as she had kissed them once before. "Is she Dotty?" Miss Galliffer whispered. "Ought I to take her by the shoulders and put her out the door? I could, you know, a scrap of a thing like that." Barbara whispered back, "I can't tell you who she is, but I wouldn't interfere with her." "Oh, the doctor will do that. He'll not—" Addressing the nurse. "Is he dead?" Miss Galliffer's tone was the curt one we use to inferiors. "No, he's not dead." "Is he going to die?" "Not this time, I think." Lottie looked round her. "Well, I'll just sit over here." She went to a chair at the back of the room in a corner on a line with the door. "I won't give him trouble. The minute he begins to live, I'll go." Mollifying Miss Galliffer. Without explaining who Letty was, she insisted on her right to remain. If Miss Galliffer was mystified, it was no more than Miss Towle was, or anyone else who touched the situation at a tangent. To that Barbara was indifferent, while Letty didn't think of it. In rallying her forces, Barbara's first recollection had been, "I must be a sport." With theoretical sporting instincts, she knew herself the kind of sport who doesn't always run true to form. Hating meanness, she could lapse into the mean, and towards Letty herself had so lapsed. That accident she must guard against. The issues were so big that whatever happened she couldn't afford to reproach herself. Self-reproach would not only magnify defeat, but poison success, since, if she availed herself of her advantages, no success would ever prove worthwhile. For her own sake, rather than for Letty's, she made use of the hour while the doctors were again in consultation to explain the possibilities. She would have the whole thing clearly understood. Whether or not Letty did understand it, she wasn't quite sure, since she seemed cut off from thought communication. She listened, nodded, was docile to instructions, but made no response. To be as lucid as possible, Barbara put it in this way. "Since you've left him and I've broken my engagement, he'll be absolutely free to choose, and yet you must remember we may both lose him." That both should lose him seemed indeed the more probable after the consultation. All the doctors looked grave, even Dr. Lancing. His dinner-party manner had forsaken him as he talked to Barbara, his emphasis being thrown on the word "prepared." It was still one of those cases in which you couldn't tell, though so far the symptoms were not encouraging. He felt himself bound in honour to say as much as that, hoping, however, for the best. Closing the front door on him, Barbara felt herself shaken by a frightful possibility. If he never regained consciousness, that would settle it. The suspense would be over. Her fate would be determined. She would no longer have to wonder and doubt, to strive or to cry. No longer would she run the risk of seeing another woman get him. She would find that which her tempestuous nature craved before everything: rest, peace, release from the impulse to battle and dominate. Not by words, not so much as by thought, but only in wild emotion, she knew that, as far as she was concerned, it might be better for him to die. If he lived and chose herself, the storm would only begin again. If he lived and chose the other— But as to that she could see no reasonable prospect. She had only to look at Letty, shrinking in her corner of the bedroom, to judge any such mischance impossible. She was so humble, so negligible, so much a bit of flotsam of the streets. She had an appeal of her own, of course, but an appeal so lowly as to be obscured by the wayside dust which covered it. What was the flower to which Rash had now and then compared her? Wasn't that what they called it? The dust flower? That ragged blue thing of byways and backyards which you couldn't touch without washing your hands afterwards? No, no, Not even the legal tie which nominally bound them could hold in the face of this inequality. It would be too grotesque. The hours passed. The night nurse was now installed, and was reading Keith MacDermot's Destiny. She was one of those tall, slender women whom you see to be all bone. As businesslike as Miss Galliffer, and quite as detached, Miss Moynes was brisk and systematic. It being her habit to subdue a household to herself before she entered on her duties, her eyes regarded Miss Walbrook and Letty with the startled glance of a horse's. For before going, Miss Galliffer had given her a hint. "You'll have to do a lot of sidestepping here. This is the famous House of Mystery. You'll find 2 nuts upstairs. That's what I'd call them if they were men. But they're women. Girls, sort of. And you've just got to leave them alone. One's a high stepper, regular society. Was engaged to the patient and now acts as if she's married to him. And the other, well, perhaps you can make her out. I can't. Seemed a little off. Maybe the poor castaway, once loved and now broken-hearted but faithful, you read about in books. Anyhow, there they are, and you'd best let them be. It won't be for more than, well, I give him 24 hours at the most. I begin to think for once old wisdom is right. Good looker too, poor fellow, and can't be more than 35. I wonder what could have happened. I suppose they'll go into that at the inquest." But Miss Moynes was too systematic to have companions in the room without marshalling them to some form of duty. They needed to eat, they needed to sleep. Now and then someone had to go out on the landing and comfort or reassure Steptoe, who sat on the attic stairs like a grief-stricken dog. Letty was the first to consent to go and lie down. She did so about 9 o'clock, extracting a promise that whatever happened she would be called at 12. If there was any change in the meantime, but that, Miss Moynes assured her, was understood in all such ride-and-tie arrangements. At 12 Letty was to return, and Barbara lie down till 3, with the same proviso in case of the unexpected. But, so to put it, the unexpected seemed improbable, in view of that rigid form and the white upturned face. "And yet," Miss Moynes confided to Barbara, "I don't think he's as far gone as they think. Miss Galliffer only changed her mind when they talked her round. A doctor just sees the patient in glimpses, whereas a nurse lives with him and knows what he can stand." About 11 Miss Moynes closed Keith MacDermot's Destiny and took the pulse. She nodded as she did so with a slight exclamation of triumph. "Aha! 58. That's the first good sign. It may not mean anything, but—" Barbara was too exhausted to feel more than a gleam of comfort. The lassitude being emotional rather than physical, Miss Moynes detected it easily enough, and sent her to rest before the hour agreed upon. She went the more willingly since the pulse had risen and hope could begin once more. On the stairs Steptoe raised his bowed head with a dazed stare. Seeing Miss Walbrook, he stumbled to his feet. "How is he now, miss?" She told him the good news. "Oh, thank God, perhaps after all he'll spare him." Steptoe informed Letty, who right on the stroke of midnight returned to her post. "Pulse gone up 2 of them degrees, madam. He's going to pull through." To Letty this was a signal. On going to rest in the little back spare room, she had thrown off her street things, worn during all the hours of watching, and put on the dressing-gown she had left there a few nights earlier. She was still wearing it, but at Steptoe's news she went back again. On passing him the second time, she was clad in the old grey rag and the battered hat in which it would be easier to escape. Steptoe said nothing, but he nodded to himself comprehendingly. A clock struck 2. Miss Moynes was hungry. Expecting to be hungry, she had had a small tray with what she called a lunch placed for her in the dining-room. Had there been immediate danger, she would not have left her post, but with Letty there she saw no harm in taking 10 or 15 minutes to conserve her strength. For the first time in all those hours, Letty was alone with him. Not expecting to be so left, she was at first frightened, then audacious. Except for the one time when she had approached the bedside and kissed his feet, she had remained in her corner, watching with the silent, motionless intentness of a little animal. Her eyes hardly ever left the white face, but at this distance even the white face was dim. Now She was possessed by a great daring. She would steal to the bedside again. Again she would see the beloved features clearly. Again she would have the amazing bliss of kissing the coverlet that covered the dear feet. When Miss Moynes returned, she would be back in her corner as if she had never left it. If the pulse rose higher, if there was further hope, if he seemed to be reviving, she could slip away in the confusion of their joy. She rose and listened. The house was as still as it had been at other times when she had listened in the night. She glided to the bed. He lay as if he had been carved in stone, propped up with pillows to make breathing easier, his arms outside the coverlet. He was a little as he had been on the morning when she had passed her hand across his brow. As then, too, his hair rose in tongues of diabolic flame. She was near him. She was bending over him. She was bending not above his feet, but above his head. She knew how mad she was, but she couldn't help herself. Stooping, closer, closer. Her lips touched the forked black mane of his hair. She leapt back. She leapt not only because of her own boldness, but because he seemed to stir. It was as if this kiss, so light, so imperceptible, had sent a galvanic throbbing through his frame. She herself felt it as now and then in winter she had felt an electric spark. Her sin had found her out. She was terrified. He lay just as he had lain before, only not quite. His arms were not just as they had been. The coverlet was slightly, ever so slightly disturbed. The nurse would see it and know that there was a stirring of a hand. It was so little of a stirring that she thought her eyes must have deceived her when it stirred again, a restless toss, like a muscular contraction in sleep. She was not alarmed now, only excited and wondering what she ought to do. She ought to run to the head of the stairs and call Miss Moynes, only that she couldn't bring herself to leave him. Then, as she stood in her attitude of doubt, the eyes opened and looked at her. They looked at her straight and yet glassily. They looked at her with no gladness in the look, almost with no recognition. If anything, there was a kind of sickness there, as if the finding her by his bedside was a disappointment. "I know what it is," she said to herself. "He wants her." But the eyes closed again. The face was as white, the profile as rigid as ever. She sped to Barbara, who was lying on a couch in the front spare room. "Come, he woke up. He wants you." Back in the bedroom, she effaced herself. They were all there now, Barbara, Steptoe, and Miss Moynes. "It's what he would do," Miss Moynes corroborated, "if he was coming back." Letty had told part of what she had seen, but only part of it. The rest was her secret. The little mermaid's kiss had left the prince as inanimate as before. Hers had brought him back to life. It was the moment to run away. Miss Moynes had said that having once opened his eyes, he would open them again. When he did, he mustn't find her there. They were all so intent on watching that this was her opportunity. They were all so intent, but Steptoe. She was buttoning her jacket when she saw his eyes steal round in her direction. A second later he had tiptoed back into the hall and closed the door behind him. It was vexing, but not fatal. He had probably gone for something. While he was getting it, she would elude him. One thing was certain. She couldn't face the look of disappointment in those sick, dark eyes again. She opened the door. She shut it noiselessly behind her. Steptoe wasn't there, and the way was free. Barbara stood, just where Letty had described herself as standing when the eyes had given her that glassy stare. To herself she seemed to stand there for ever, though the time could be counted in minutes. The pounding of her heart was like a pulsating of the house. The eyes opened again. They opened, first wearily, and then with a fretful light which seemed to be searching for what they couldn't find. Barbara stood still. There was another stirring of the hand, irritated, impatient. A little moan or groan was distinctly in complaint. The eyes having rolled hither and thither helplessly, the head turned slowly on the pillow so as to see the other side of the room. "He's looking for something that he misses," Miss Moynes explained wonderingly. "What do you suppose it can be?" "He wants her," Barbara found her at the street door, pleading with Steptoe, who actually held her by the arm. The loud whisper down the stairs was a cry as well as a command. "Come!" At the bedroom door they parted. With a light, instinctive push, Barbara forced Letty to go back to the spot on which she had stood earlier. She herself went to the other side of the bed, only to find that the head, in which the eyes were closed again, was now turned that way. As if aware that some mysterious decision was approaching, Miss Moynes kept herself in the background. Steptoe had hardly advanced from the threshold. Neither of the women by the bedside seemed to breathe. When the eyes opened for the third time, the intelligence in them was keener. On Barbara they rested long, quietly, kindly, till memory came back. With memory there was again that restless stirring, that complaining moan. Once more, slowly, distressfully, the head turned on the pillow. On Letty, the long, quiet, kindly regard lay as it had lain on Barbara. They waited, but in the look there was no more than that. From two hearts, two silent prayers were going up. "O God, end it somehow, and let me have peace." "O God, make him live again, and give them to each other." Then, when no one was expecting it, a faint smile quivered on the lips, as if the returning mind saw something long desired and comforting. Faintly, feebly, unsteadily, the hands were raised toward the dust flower. The lips moved, enough to form dumbly the one word, "Come." The invitation was beyond crediting. Letty trembled and shrank back. But from the support of the pillow the whole figure leaned forward. The hands were lifted higher, more firmly and more longingly. Strength came with the need for strength. A smile which was of life, not death, beamed on the features and brought colour to the face, which had all these hours seemed carved in stone. "He'll do now," the nurse threw off professionally. "He'll be up in a few days." It was Barbara who gave the sign to both Steptoe and Miss Moynes. By the imperiousness of her gesture and her uplifted head, she swept them out before her. If she was leaving all behind her, she was leaving it superbly. But she wasn't leaving all. Back of her tumultuous passions, a spirit was crying to her spirit, "Now you'll get what you want far more than you want this. Rest from vain desire." Letty approached the bedside slowly, as if drawn by an enchantment. To the outstretched hands she stretched out hers. The door was closed, and once more she was alone with him. But neither saw that for the space of a few inches the closed door was opened again, and that an old profile peered within. Then, as slowly, 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 Letty sank on her knees, bowing her head on the hands which drew her closer and closer still. A pair of old lips smiled contentedly. When the head drew back, the door was closed again. End of chapter 26. End of The Dust Flower by Basil King.